Yeah.
Okay, welcome. Thanks for joining on a Friday afternoon. I'm Tom Taggart, and Augustine's here with me. We're going to go through some updates on where things stand with tariffs and the end of de minimis for China and Hong Kong products, and walk through some options of what merchants can do to adjust and to access the U.S. market. So I head up the global trade team here at Passport. Been in the international shipping and public policy world for about 20 years, and glad to have Augustine with us. He comes from a background in international shipping, but also more importantly, a strong background working for some high-level merchants and marketplaces. I'll turn it over to you, Augustine.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. As Tom mentioned, I'm Augustine. I recently joined Passport earlier this year, but I have over 20 years of experience in managing operations and cross-border e-commerce for D2C brands, as well as large merchants and e-commerce platforms, as well as experience in the international logistics business. So happy to be here and help facilitate this session and give you some background and some alternatives and options as we navigate the complexities of the current landscape that we're seeing in the US particularly.
Yes, thank you. So this webinar is being recorded. We'll send out the recording, and you'll have access to that content afterwards. And feel free to throw questions in the chat there in the Q&A box. We're going to leave some good time for questions. I think there's a lot to address and to get through, and certainly look forward to hearing from you and what you're seeing on your side. We'll dive into the little background on tariffs and de minimis and how that has evolved over time, and then get into some of the recent changes and how that has impacted access to the U.S. market, and present a couple models that can work to help you and keep access and mitigate the impact of tariffs.
All right, so let me take it from here first. We want to give you some history of what the Minimis means and how it all started. And this goes back to 1930, way before the internet or even globalization and global trade as we know it today, or the advent of China as a power. when the U.S. created or enacted a tariff act to basically help the U.S. And American businesses and farmers. So at this point, they raised significantly the duties on import goods to create a more protectionist environment in the U.S. And then in 1938, they set up what was called the Minimis at a very low number of only $1. And this was mainly to reduce the processing and the burden of handling imports when individuals were crossing the border. Again, this was much way before the internet, and where just people were bringing products from abroad, either through traveling for vacation or business. And they set that to, again, $1, so very low. So anything below that number was basically that amount was basically duty free, and there was no need to declare or do any customs processing. That number stayed very low until the 90s, when it was then slowly increased to about $5. And then something big happened in 2015 when the U.S. government enacted the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. And at that point, the minimum was raised to $800, and that opened up the gate for cross-border e-commerce. The following year, in 2016, the number of shipping entering the U.S. below the de minimis under what's now called Type 86 started going up, and it was 153 million at first. And this was mainly driven by the big e-commerce platforms and marketplaces, primarily in China, Alibaba first, and now Temu and Shein, as well as later on even US or international direct-to-consumer brands who wanted to take advantage of this floor, with the minimus, and started putting warehouses in either Canada or Mexico, bring inventory from factories in Asia, hosted there, and then until an order takes place, that was below $800, facilitate the transaction and move it across duty-free to the US. Fast forward into 2024, and the volume exploded. So now, last year, we had 1.4 billion shipments entering the US under the de minimis program, where the majority of it, over 75%, is actually coming from China and Hong Kong. So as you can see, this program, who was initially created for something very different, was eventually taking advantage or taking opportunity by the e-commerce industry. Now, let's now look at today. During the second Trump administration, President Trump was talking during his campaign a lot about how to protect the border and go against illicit import of goods coming from or drugs coming from China, primarily to fight the crisis in the U.S. with fentanyl. So he used something called the AIPA Act at the start of his administration to execute some executive orders, and on the 1st of February, he actually repealed the de minimis completely, to basically not allow any shipment coming into the US below 800 to be duty-free. That caused a lot of confusion and problems at the border, and it was almost immediately reinstated after 4 days on February 5th, primarily because the Customs and Border Protection Agency, as well as the US Postal Service, were not yet prepared to handle the influx of shipments that were coming in below the $800 de minimis and process them with either formal or informal imports. Then, in a subsequent executive order during what was called Liberation Day in early April, along the increase of tariffs to most countries, there was also a declaration there of removing the minimus primarily for China and Hong Kong starting on May 2nd, which it already took place. And then there was also comment about wanting to remove it not only for these two countries, or China primarily, but also to the rest of the world when the systems were ready. It's not entirely very clear when will this happen, but there is some speculation that we will see a complete removal of the minimums later this year, somewhere in the from July to September timeframe. Again, this is just a speculation. We don't know yet for sure, but there's some indication that this could take place. And then in parallel, there have been some bills going through Congress, which are bipartisan by both parties, trying to look at how do they completely eliminate this program into the future. Now, this may take longer for them, and they're proposing a July 2027 timeframe for that. So all in all, it looks like this program is going to be eventually, sooner or later, terminated. Now, what have we seen so far since May 2nd? So the volume has dramatically been reduced since the repeal on China and Hong Kong, from over 4 million packages per day coming through the de minimis, now to no more than 660,000 shipments per day are being processed under the de minimis just after May 2nd. So this can tell us how significant the volume from China and Hong Kong were, which is over 85%, as we see the drop. Now, other things that we've been seeing is an increase in enforcement and rejections from shipments coming from China and Hong Kong. There has been over 100,000 shipments rejected from the de minimis program, and 90% of total detentions are actually due to violations of the de minimis program, right? Also, there's been enforcement and suspensions to brokers that are maybe not declaring properly or trying to circumvent some of the rules. And out of 40 broker visits, there's been 6 suspensions so far as of last week. And then there's also been an increase in what's called Type 11 or informal entries since the repeal of the de minimis for China and Hong Kong to about 87,000. Other things that Customs and Border Protection Agency, or CBP, is been doing, they've been improving their systems and quality of data. They have added warning and rejection messages for consignees that are approaching the $800 day limit. Remember, this de minimis has a limit per day per consignee or importer, which is again 800. As I mentioned, there's been broker suspensions. They've been adding some data validations to the way manifest information is being added. They're also starting to collaborate with international postal operators, and they are now starting to use also machine learning and AI to better target and enforce the rule of the law as this program gets modified and implemented. Now, what is the impact that we've seen so far on direct-to-consumer brands? So basically, after May 2nd, if you're importing anything, regardless of value, that products that are made in China and Hong Kong, you'll have to declare them under 2 different import types. Informal entries, or Type 11, for orders or goods that are below $2,500, and then formal entries, or Type 01, for orders over $2,500 or also regulated items. Now, then what happened, and this is just very recent, the US and China now finally started talking, and they sat down to the negotiation table. So as of May 14, the reciprocal tariff that was implemented during the April and that went up all the way to 125%, it came back down to temporarily to 10% as all the other countries that were impacted during the so-called Liberation Day. But this is only for 90 days. So the assumption is that within these 90 days, the US and China will reach some sort of agreement. But at this point, we don't know yet. So for now, the minimis is repelled for China and Hong Kong, and the reciprocal tariff is at 10% up to, let's say, middle of August of this year. Another thing that was also mentioned is the increase of duty to also prevent any misuse of the postal network into 54%, as well as $100 per item, right? So again, this is to control also the influx of orders coming from China and Hong Kong through the postal network. Although most of the large e-commerce platforms are using actually courier companies to get the products into the US. So this doesn't necessarily impact too much the direct-to-consumer business. Yeah, so as I mentioned, August 12th is when now we are expecting that the pause will end, and potentially, if there's no agreement reached, the tariff can go all the way up again to 125%. And what you see here is just a simple example of explaining how all these tariffs are actually stacking. So we start with the now so-called reciprocal tariff, which went from 125 back to 10%. And in February, there was the, as I mentioned, the IEEPA, also called Fentanyl Emergency Act, set up for China at 20%. And then you have other tariffs that were implemented during the first Trump administration for specific goods, primarily coming from China, under what's called Section 301, and then the standard duty rates that apply to your goods. So you can see here in the tables on the right an example of a T-shirt coming from China, a shipment of T-shirts coming from China, where with all these tariffs, they, as you add them up, they actually end up stacking to close to 70% duties, which is still very high, right? So for this particular example, a shipment that entering the US was declared at $18,700 US. Now with the reciprocal tariff, even at 10%, there is a almost $13,000 duty exposure that the importer will have to pay upon arrival. So as you can see here, the situation is very fluid. There is obviously an opportunity to improve or facilitate or work with brands to better manage their supply chain and reconfigure their models so to bring products into the US more efficiently. And that's what we are now gonna talk. So I'm gonna hand it over now to Tom. I don't know, Tom, if you wanna mention anything of what we discussed so far.
Yeah, that's the big thing right there, that even though there has been a reduction in the tariffs on China and Hong Kong goods, it is still significant. It can exceed 100% for some brands. So something we want to help address and give you some ways to approach it and mitigate that.
All right, so let's move on. Now, Tom, if you want to go over the basically how Passport is helping brands with our two offers to navigate the current landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And the first is very simple, and it's very straightforward, and that is move inventory to the US and fulfill locally. And that allows you to bring unsold inventory in at the price that you paid the manufacturer or the supplier for it, which reduces the impact of tariffs and other entry fees. And the other we're seeing is something that's been around primarily for large multinationals, which is getting an interest in the e-commerce world, and that is using a cross-border direct-to-consumer model, but going through a U.S. Subsidiary as an intermediary, so commonly called B2B2C. And we'll walk through both of those and see what would be the best fit for your particular scenario. Okay, so starting with in-country fulfillment, or as we like to call it, in-country enablement, because it is a lot more than just picking and packing and shipping in order. There are many more benefits to it than just that. But you're just moving unsold inventory to a US 3PL and holding it here domestically. And then when the orders are placed, they're shipped out with a domestic final mile carrier, which gives you a faster time in transit and a lower final mile cost. And not to mention a bulk freight import cost, which is lower than a cross-border cost. So all in, this can be a very attractive way to reduce the tariff impact. You know, you are paying the price that you purchase the goods from your manufacturer or supplier. That is the declared value for customs, and that should be significantly less than the retail price. So a good way to mitigate the impact of the tariffs there, but also provide a better experience because the goods already are in market. There are no surprises with transportation delays, ocean or air freight, or any delays with customs clearance. It's already cleared and it's ready to be fulfilled. And then you have, if returns are important to your category, then a domestic returns option is certainly available for the in-country model. All right, so you can set it up yourself and manage it end to end, or you can go through a third party. And one thing Passport offers is just that, the end to end outsourcing of this in-country enablement model, from the freight forwarding and uplift to the U.S. and customs clearance, acting as the importer of record and taking on that responsibility for duties and fees, and working through partner 3PLs to get better rates for warehousing and management, and of course some domestic final mile rates there as well. And the big thing here is just managing not only the duties and fees that are due on import, but also the state sales tax as the merchant or seller of record here. And 47 states in the U.S. require some sort of sales tax registration and remittance once a certain threshold is crossed. And it's a lot to keep up with for merchants. So being able to outsource that tax liability and collection and remittance is certainly a big benefit. And not to mention having a local bank that can reduce processing fees and transaction fees. And lastly, other ways to recover expenses if goods are imported into the U.S. and then re-exported, sold cross-border to other markets like Canada or Mexico, then you can reclaim the U.S. import duties that were paid through drawback, and also something that Passport facilitates. All right, many of you have probably been pitched a B2B2C solution, sometimes called 3B2C, depending on the provider. Does it work? Yes, it's something that multinationals have done for many years. Does it work for e-commerce merchants? We're going to have to explore that, because it's not going to be viable for everyone. There's a lot more to it than just setting up an LLC in Wyoming. It's not just going through a company's formation and creating an overnight entity in the U.S. There's the threshold here to manage this compliantly is actually really high. So we do want to spend a little time to walk through some of those risks and some of those hurdles and see if it is a fit for your model. So the goal here is to reduce the declared value for customs, and the way of doing that through the B2B2C model. The first B2B is the UK parent company is selling to the US subsidiary, the US entity, and that allows you to claim an intercompany sale price, a transfer price that is lower than the retail price that the consumer paid at checkout, but it's going to be more than the price that you paid your manufacturer or supplier for the goods. So as an example, on the left here, if you purchased from your supplier at 25, that's not the price you're going to claim on this intercompany sale price. Not even close. There's a couple ways to get to it, but it's going to be closer to 45, 50, 55. You have to include all of your costs of that good, as well as a realistic profit for that transfer price to hold up. So right there, the benefits of it are diluted a bit because the value that you're claiming is significantly more than the price that you paid the manufacturer or the supplier. Your U.S. entity is the importer of record, taking on all liability there for customs, fines, penalties, and fees. They declare on that $45 transfer price, and that's the declared value for assessing duties and fees. And then once it's in country, a couple different ways. Some providers are positioning a merchant of record model where the U.S. consumer is already sold to this MOR, and then a transfer happens between the U.S. entity to the MOR to the consumer post import. And all of that leaves you with a margin between the retail sale price of $100 and what you paid the UK parent company at that transfer price. We'll walk through some implications of that, the tax exposure, as well as the restrictions on how much of that money could be remitted back to the parent company. Okay, it's a really high hurdle to pull this off compliantly. We have run this through a handful of trade attorneys and trade consultants, and the feedback is consistent. If you look at the customs rulings here, they are very well documented. Customs practically gives you a checklist of everything you need to do to compliantly execute this intercompany transfer model. But the first thing Customs is going to look at is this really a U.S. entity, or is it just a shell company set up to act as an agent on behalf of the U.K. Company? And that means this U.S. entity has to have U.S. employees, has to have a management team that's acting independently of the parent company. They have decision-making authority. Right there, it's a high bar. It's an added cost. It's U.S. Federal tax exposure at 21% tax. And then you get into how the relationship looks between this U.S. subsidiary and the parent company. Are they really acting independently, or is the U.S. subsidiary just taking direction from the parent company? There can be no restrictions on what that U.S. subsidiary does, what the goods, once they purchase them and once they import them. If you pass that hurdle, you move on to how this U.S. entity is acting. Are they really acting independently? Can they select their own customers? Can they set their own prices? Can they provide instructions back to the parent company on how to structure that setup? And then vendors, can the U.S. entity purchase from whichever vendors they like? Can they arrange the delivery and the import? And then sale price. We haven't even talked about what a sale price looks like. Transfer price is not simple. It's not just coming up with a price that you're going to think is fair. There's a lot of rules around it. And it starts with whether there was an arm's length transaction. Did the relationship between the subsidiary and the parent company influence this price? And if it did, right there, Customs is going to discount the setup and advance the price declared at Customs to the full retail value that the consumer paid. And then you get into if you are selling to other resellers in the U.S., then you already have a wholesale price that you've declared. They would expect the transfer price to be very similar to that. If you don't have resellers, then they're going to look at other pricing methodologies. You may have to conduct a transfer pricing study, which is very detailed and complex, or you can use all of your costs, not just the cost of purchasing the product, but there's a laundry list of additional costs that you have to include in that, and then a realistic profit. 3% is not realistic, so they're going to want to see something much more realistic, depending on the industry that you're in and the commodity that you're selling, and making sure that is in line with other standards. Or you can start with the resale price and work backwards, taking out some operating costs from that U.S. subsidiary, and also taking out what you think that approved profit should be for the U.S. subsidiary. Okay, and here's the kicker. It sounds like a great deal. It sounds like if you listen to some of the pitches, you just set up a paper entity, and all you have to do is you claim $50, but you're selling it for $100, and now you've got this extra $50 of margin there that you can just send back to the parent company. Not how it works. That money has to stay with the U.S. entity. So the right there, you see that the definition of transaction value is the price paid plus proceeds of any subsequent sale. And this is very clearly documented in customs rulings of law that if the buyer is sending an additional payment to the seller, then they have to go back and amend the customs value to account for that additional payment. And that means that the $50 of margin there cannot simply just be flowed back to the parent company. That means that it has to stay in with the U.S. subsidiary, really making this only viable for merchants who have a fully fledged U.S. entity that has their own set of books and is operating independently and can manage that. Otherwise, this really is not just an easy workaround to declare a lower value and then flow those funds back to the parent company. So do want to mention all those risks up front. Again, this is a legitimate, viable model for some merchants if they meet that criteria. But it is something you want to go into with eyes wide open, because that U.S. entity is the party responsible. They're the importer of record, and they're the party that customs is going to look to, not only for civil penalties here, not only for additional duties and fees, but these are criminal charges that U.S. Customs brings against violations and attempts to avoid duties and fees. We sometimes forget that Customs is a law enforcement agency, but they very much are. They have badges, they carry guns, they have little silver bracelets attached to their belts, and they are looking to make an example of some companies who try to skirt the new tariffs that have been implemented. So definitely something to approach with eyes wide open and make sure that full diligence has been done in the setup, and that you are covered and not exposed to any risk there. Okay, we'll leave you with some resources here. We try to keep the Trump Trade Tracker updated as often as possible to keep track of the daily changes and hourly changes in the trade environment, as well as some great posts on LinkedIn that explain many of these setups. And with that, let's jump right into some Q&A. So we have a few things come in here, and the first is explaining some examples of the 54% on the postal network and the 100. What's this mean for USPS? It really means you're not seeing postal move out of China or Hong Kong right now. The carrier, of course, China Post is not moving their own packages. They're contracting with an air freight provider to move those parcels, and that carrier is responsible for collecting either 54% of the value of what's in that package or a flat $100 per item, and remitting that on entry. That means really postal is non-existent for e-commerce coming out of China and Hong Kong today.
Tom, I think one of the, maybe if we can clarify, and I don't know if I was very clear, is it 54 or $100 per item, or 54% and $100 per item?
Yeah,
when
that's
it comes
right.
to the US.
Yeah, the interesting thing is they're allowing the air carrier to choose which one to use, either the 54% or the $100.
Right, and also to just be clear, this is only impacting shipments that, as Tom mentioned, are coming through the postal network, which is China Post contracting different carriers to bring basically the mail or small packages into the U.S. So most of these shipments are almost put to a halt because of the high burden and high rates. And again, this is also to try to reduce or minimize as much as possible the influx of goods that could be considered counterfeits or illicit materials or even drugs into the U.S. as part of this emergency act that the government put into effect earlier in February. So something to consider, but again, also Chinese sellers. It's interesting because even on Amazon, about more than 50 to 70% of third-party merchants are actually in China. So this has a huge impact into their business. Some of them may be using the postal networks to deliver low-value goods into U.S. consumers and doorsteps. So this is also having a huge impact into the Amazon business, not only the Sheins and Temus of the world. So something to consider.
Yeah, and the 54, I know it is confusing, and we've seen a few articles that have misinterpreted it. For most packages are going through a commercial clearance with a private customs broker. The postal clearance channel is very much separate and different from how most couriers or express carriers would enter goods into the U.S. So with that, the base for everything else, China or Hong Kong origin, is 30%. That is the 10% reciprocal plus the 20% additional or fentanyl tariffs. So it's a 30% base. And as you saw from that example, it goes up from there. Many merchants are subject to the 301 tariffs, which are either 7.5% or upwards of 25%. And then you still have the standard duty rate that still applies. So I definitely want to make the distinction between those two channels.
Yeah, good call out. There is another question: is it possible to get China origin packages via Royal Mail from the UK? Tom, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I think what you mean there is if you have a China origin package that's a China origin product in the UK today, can you ship it to the US? You can. One interesting thing about the postal network is there is no requirement to declare the country of origin. However, there's a lot of scrutiny around it. We're seeing packages held and inspected, and we're seeing some repercussions there. There are definitely suppliers and vendors that are trying to route postal products through other countries, whether that's Vietnam or even Canada or UK. That is certainly something that is getting the attention of customs and something they're looking for. So by the books, no, if it is China origin, it would still be subject to the duties and fees, and that means it would have to go through a formal entry in the U.S. Regardless of the value, that means that the consumer is going to get a letter from USPS saying that we have your package, go find a U.S. customs broker, declare this package, and pay all these additional fees.
Yeah, and as I was mentioning earlier, there is increased collaboration between U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the international postal networks providers in different markets. So while this can be considered a loophole temporarily, we don't necessarily recommend using this as a standard practice. Because of what just Tom mentioned, this. Technically speaking, there's country of origin is not required for the regular mail, but we've been hearing of detentions and packages being held at the border, and yes, a letter sent to customers requesting to pay the $54 or $100 before their package can be cleared. So something to keep in mind, not necessarily use it as a standard practice. All right.
So, Arsenio, let me ask you about what you've seen in past experiences from warehouse cost and how that compares when you're evaluating. Do I ship direct to consumer and try to set up a B2B2C model, or do I look at moving inventory? What does that typically look like for the inventory costs?
Yeah. So from some of my experience, there's a couple of things the brands need to look at, right? When deciding to continue doing cross-border e-commerce, shipping from their home warehouse to forward deploying inventory, in this case to the US, where there is value of bringing the product at cost, um, declaring it at cost before a sale has taken place, and therefore lowering the base of the duty calculation. The challenge of that model is you obviously need to rebalance your inventory, look at how are you shipping that inventory? Do you want to bring it directly from your manufacturer in China into the US, or separate and forward deploy inventory from your home 3PL? So inventory forecasting and planning when you're splitting and allocating units to at least another warehouse is something that you got to consider. If you have a large SKU count, it becomes more complex. If you have less products and deeper quantities, it's probably easier to forward deploy. Of course, the incremental cost of operating another warehouse, the fixed cost of running a 3PL, not only your home market but in the US, need to be considered as you look at your overall margin. Now you balance that with the incremental cost of now shipping cross border, as we saw in this B2C model, where unless you want to keep the clearing at retail value after the sale took place and having to pay the 30 to 70% rates and duties on your retail value, as the order comes into the US from, in this case, the UK. The only way to do it is, as you mentioned, is setting up a US entity. That has also increased operational cost and running the accounting and books and the clearing taxes in the US comes at a cost as well from an SG&A standpoint as you look at your P&L. So I think you got a balance between, of course, the increased cost of running another warehouse and managing your inventory forecasting versus the on one end versus the increased cost of setting up an entity in the US and managing all the accounting and transfer pricing as we saw. So all in all, I think a good exercise is to run some sort of apples to apples comparison of your profit margins when you're evaluating these two alternatives. Both come with benefits and with challenges. Again, in my experience, moving inventory across borders is not an easy activity, but sometimes as brands grow, makes more sense to get closer to that end consumer or offer a better service and transit time, and then the brand also manage the cost, the unit cost in a more tight and more favorable basis. So both of them have pros and cons, and I think that's where we're here for, to support brands that are looking into how do they expand their business into the US in a more profitable way.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So another question about, do we expect de minimis to be eliminated for all origins? Yes, it seems to be heading that way. That would be my interpretation. There are more than 6 bills before Congress that would do just that. There is a budget bill that's working its way through Congress right now that would eliminate de minimis for all origins by 2017. I don't think, or 2027. I don't think we're going to have to wait to 2027. I think that's going to happen sooner than later. When we see that Customs is making changes to systems as early as September, that could enable the de minimis to be eliminated for more origin countries. But remember that the original executive order that reinstated the de minimis was only temporary. It said de minimis will be reinstated for China, Canada, and Mexico until such time that adequate systems are in place to collect the revenue and process these packages. So Customs is very much working toward establishing those adequate systems, and we do think that de minimis will ultimately be eliminated for all origins.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that 85% of the volume of the Minimis was coming from China and Hong Kong, which went away on May 4th. So that means that the Customs and Department of Commerce only need to look at systems, because somehow they're already managing the volume through the other entry types, type 11 and type 01. So from a system standpoint, it doesn't seem to be very much of additional work to then remove the other 15%, and then let all countries basically be excluded. Now there is a question about Canada. I don't know, Tom, what your point of view here. I think you could argue that some countries may have some different provisions that would allow for some programs similar to the Minimis that are favorable for those nations. I don't think we have heard anything specific, at least not myself.
That's right. We do have free trade agreements, and they are all being reworked. And USMCA or CUSMA, if you like, if you're in Canada, is up for renewal and renegotiation. And this will very much be a consideration. Hard to say whether it makes it through the final cut, and whether U.S. and Mexico are exempted here and de minimis is still applied. I'd say as a starting point, it's going to be eliminated for all countries, and from there, I think it's going to be a negotiating point and see if they can work it back into the updated NAFTA/USMCA.
All right. So Tom, maybe I should ask you how, if I'm a UK brand, what are the key questions or key decision-making points, or issues I need to look at concerning regulations and that if they want to go into this B2B2C model, like what are the key things that they need to be aware? I think you mentioned most of them already, but if I'm thinking, okay, I have a cross-border solution into the US, and I just want to basically avoid paying as much duties as possible, what are the key 3 to 5 points I need to look at?
Yeah, it really starts with, what is that U.S. entity subsidiary? Is it just a single member LLC disregarded with no employees and no physical, no permanent establishment in the U.S.? If that's the case, that you can discount this model right off the bat. But if you do pass that threshold, it is a legitimate U.S. entity with U.S. employees and a management decision team here, and running completely independent of the parent company, then there is a way to set that up in a compliant way. It's a heavy lift. It's an administrative burden. The paper trail required is extensive, and it's almost like a heist movie, like watching Ocean's 11. Everything has to go just right, and if anything is out of place, it all falls apart. And that's the trick with going through one of these audits with Customs, is that they're going to require an enormous amount of detail and supporting documentation to justify it. As they're going to look at the model, and they're going to do one of two things. The first and most likely is they're just going to advance the value that you declared to the retail value that the consumer paid at checkout. And then it's on you to go back and file a protest and try to present your case. Now you're guilty until proven innocent. Now, the other approach is they can send you what's called a Customs Form 28, which is a request for information. where they will say, show us all your cards and we're going to go through this in excruciating detail. It's a full audit. It's like a tax audit, but worse. And you have to have everything in place. And the real question is this viable for e-commerce merchants? And I think in some cases, if you really do have a U.S. subsidiary and it is acting independently, then yes, this is something that many companies do all day long. But they've gone through the effort and the work required to set it up in a compliant way. If you're being positioned in a productized solution, an out of the box thing that you just set up an LLC and we're going to have you up and running tomorrow, and you can be shipping and declaring $20 on this the value for customs, even though it's sold for $100 to the customer. That's just not realistic, and it's just not going to hold up. And I know when we've talked to trade attorneys about this, when they present everything that's required, many merchants just cannot meet that threshold and decide it just doesn't make sense for them.
So I think net, even though it's a solution, it's available. As you mentioned, it's complex to set up. It's not necessarily an out of the box, and as maybe many people have heard from other providers, it's not necessarily that simple to set up. And what we're saying is that you also need to look under the hood and understand all the complexities and regulatory requirements that you have to be compliant with if you want to set up a model like this, right?
That's right. Yeah, this is new territory, right? There really are no customs rulings specific to this model for e-commerce merchants in today's environment. The case law out there is largely based on multinationals who do have legitimate established entities. So the thing here is I would ask for some documentation. I would ask for a binding ruling that says this is compliant. Anything, a letter from the director of the port with U.S. Customs that says yes, this valuation model is approved. They can do. You can ask Customs ahead of time. This is my model. This is how I plan to declare the value. Is this compliant? And they'll give you an interpretation. But without that, I think you're really taking a risk that this is something that's just very new and untested and not likely to hold up on their audit.
So in-country fulfillment, which is the other option we can support, it's also a very viable alternative for small, medium brands based out of the UK who are looking at importing into and can continue selling to the US at a more cost-effective way, right? Where we can help facilitating. In that scenario, we do play importer record role, and we act more hand in hand with the merchant and help them relocate inventory into one of our 3PL partners in the US at a lower valuation. And then the administrative burden there is not necessarily as high. It's just obviously the inventory and the forecasting that needs to take account for, and then obviously the additional cost of running through Passport or an operation in the US, correct?
That's right, and that is a model that has been tested. Countless merchants have moved inventory to the U.S. to fulfill, especially if you're selling through a marketplace. This is an established, compliant model. It's pretty straightforward, and it's something that has been pressure tested.
Yeah, and in fact, we've seen some of the big Chinese sellers or marketplaces starting to only allow for that. I think there was some announcement of Shein not permitting their Chinese sellers to continue doing cross-border shipping and only allowing for deploy inventory, if that's correct, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so, absolutely. It's the cleanest, most compliant way to access the market.
Great. Any other questions? I don't think we see any other questions from the audience. All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time. I know it's Friday afternoon in the UK, still early here in the US, or if you are somewhere else in the East Coast, midday. But thanks for listening, and we're here to support as you navigate this environment. And feel free to reach out. We're here to help. Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining, and we'll make this available as a resource. And always happy to talk it through. If you have questions about the setup, always feel free to contact us.
All right. Have a nice weekend.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.